Music theory with Microsoft Excel. Negative compound modal distance or negative compound modal distance intervals as compared to negative compound scale degree intervals. Alternative names for a distance of over an octave in the down or negative direction. Get ready and some coffee because you ain't never seen rockin' unless you excel at rockin', and for that we need Microsoft Excel. We are in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay because we basically built this from a blank worksheet but started in a prior presentation. So if you want to build this entire worksheet from a blank sheet, you could begin back there or just construct the current part of the table that we're working on. If you do have access to this workbook though, 4 tabs down below, fretboard, example, practice blank, the fretboard tab having a simulated fretboard we will refer to, the example tab, in essence the answer key, the practice tab having pre-formatted cells. So you can practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting, but if you don't have any of that, that's okay because we'll be working in the blank tab where we started from scratch from a blank worksheet, and we'll be continuing in essence, the unformatted blank part of the worksheet, practicing both our Excel skills and music skills at the same time. Let's go to the fretboard tab. Remembering what we are doing, we're looking at interval distances, trying not to get confused by the scale degree terminology throwing us out of the way we would like to visualize the fretboard because it's the optimal and best way, that being the fretboard as a map of the territory, like the globe having 7 continent destination locations, and it has 5 other non-destination locations, which we're going to be calling similar to the oceans, which we go through in order to get to the destination locations. If we're above the world, our head above the fretboard, above this low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, looking down on the earth of the fretboard, we note that it's spinning around. We're gonna give it 12 degrees of spin as it rotates to the right. And we're going to name those based on our notes in the musical alphabet, typically working in the notes related to collection of notes of the key of C. But note that if we go to the C sharp, the D sharp, the whole thing will shift to the right, and therefore, once we've located our vantage point, we no longer want to be listing the notes by note name, but rather by continent name, which would be like the Nashville number system, which is basically a number system for the modes: Ionian, Lydian, Aeolian, Dorian, Mixolydian, and so on and so forth. Now, part of the problem is that when we name chords and when we name intervals, we do so with scale degrees, which forces us out of our mindset that is optimal if we're not careful, such as going from here to here. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4 notes away. But what do we call it? A major third. The major third means 4 notes away, but it implies that this no longer is called a G note or a Mixolydian or a Nashville number system 5. It's now the 1 for some reason. That becomes an issue. So we want to not let that happen. Also, if I go in the negative direction, it becomes difficult because there's not a scale degree terminology that's as consistent when we go in the negative direction, particularly if we go in the negative direction and we're traveling more than 12 notes back, more than an octave in the negative direction. That's the problem we'll deal with this time. Now remember, if we go to our analogy here, we're going to have fret 5 through 8 on our fretboard, just putting the map on top of the fretboard. So we have our continents: North America, Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica. Then we put the oceans in between here. That's going to be our analogy. If we put it around in a circle, it looks like this. If we then go from like this note 4, Australia, we usually count around in the circle this way. We can count by continent or continent and ocean. So if I'm on the 4 and I want to get to the 7, how far is that? 1, 2, 3 continents forward. I would call those modal half steps, directional wise forward. If I count in scale degrees, I would have to make Australia the 1. I would rename the continent to scaled position 1, which I don't want to do. I'd like to keep calling it Australia the 4, right? That's why I don't think that's the optimal way to do it. But if I count the oceans, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. To get to Europe, that would be equivalent to the notes. I could go backwards. negative 1, 2, 3, 4 continents, which would be negative 4 modal half steps, or scale degree, make that the 1, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, negative 5th scale degree. But nobody uses negative scale degrees for some reason, so when we go backwards, it's a mess. Or we can count the continents and the oceans backwards, negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, negative 6 notes back. But what if I'm going backwards here and I'm going all the way around the circle again to get there? I'm going around the block and then ending on Europe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it would be negative 11 if I think of it as continent hopping, right? Or negative modal half steps. Now again, if you're not using modal half steps, it would be scale degrees, which would be one negative higher, right? A higher negative number. But again, we don't use scale degrees going backwards typically. It gets all messy. So our terminology is more clean going backwards, and that's what we want to get in our mind. So if I go to the blank tab, note, even if you're going to be using the normal conventional language, you want to think, how am I going to deal with the fact that I do have directionality going backwards when it goes negative up this way, and then I have an issue where I go negative past an octave backwards? How can I understand the normal terminology to do that? And beyond that, I might better be able to measure it like a normal person would measure it if you were to do it yourself. Like if you were just to come up with a system to measure it backwards, what would you do? You'd look at the node that you are on and you would measure the distance using the two different terms that we could use, either measuring in half steps or modal half steps backwards. Noting that modal half steps isn't a perfect term because it's different depending on the node you're on. But as long as you know the node you're on, then it works perfect. Then you're using measurement terms. What we're using over here we've introduced another idea that isn't a measurement term, that being that we're measuring based on the major scale, and therefore when we say major or minor or perfect, that's based on comparing everything to the major scale, which we don't really need to do because we already have our terms of measurement. The terms of measurement are half steps, and if you want to, scale degrees, which is not the best term because, again, you shouldn't start at 1, you should start at 0. The better term would be modal half steps, forwards and backwards. So that's why this system is a little wonky. It would be more clean to do something like this, but no one talks that way typically. However, it'll be easier to kind of understand this system if you were to do it from scratch. Okay, that's going to be the idea. So what we did is we took the 12 notes in the musical alphabet. We picked out 7 of them, working on the collection of notes around the view of the C major, and then we have our nodes related to them. We then mapped out going forward the normal distance, the 12 different distances like a ruler, and gave the normal names, which are based on the major scale for all the large majors and the perfects, and then the minors and the diminished is kind of stuffed in there for anything that doesn't fit in the major scale. Then we thought, okay, how would we measure this if we were to measure it by node and not scale degree? And that we can use a modal range this way, or a modal range with numbers, and then we can use a distance term, the first number being the note distance, the second number being the distance from the node, which is the letter, in modal half steps. So this is going to be a little bit more clear because, again, it tells you exactly this is exactly the distance in distance terms from the node in the middle. So that's going to be that. And then we went forward and said, what if we go past a scale, an octave going up in the normal direction? Well, I could name it this way. For example, this 16, I could call it a 16 note away major third. I think that's the nicest way to do it under the normal convention because it tells you the total distance and gives you the major third as though you're going around a circle, and that allows you to get the flavor and the distance. But you can also call it a 16 note away major tenth Why major 10th? Because we keep counting up. There's 7 scale degrees. And then if I go up to here plus another major third, which would bring it up to here, a major 10. Okay, so that would mean I'm counting up if this is the scale degree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8, 9, 10. That would be the 10th scale degree. I don't think people usually use that terminology, but it's in the textbooks that way. The problem with the over here, it makes more sense if we use the Ionian or measure around the node. Then I can still do it either way, right? I can go up forward and say we're going, I did the 16. We're going 16 notes forward from the Ionian, and it's going to be 2 modal half steps forward, which would be the 3rd scale degree. So similar construction here, but now we're using distances around the node that we're on. But we could also say it's a 16 note forward Ionian 9, which would be the 10th scale degree. So why would it be the 9th? Because if we're using distance and we're on the Ionian, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? 9 forward, because I'm not counting from 1, I'm counting from 0 because it's a distance term. Now then we said, okay, what if we're going in the negative direction? If we go in the negative direction, our normal naming convention kind of falls apart because they don't do scale degrees going backwards. Meaning if I'm on the Ionian here and I go backwards, lower in pitch, then you would think that would be the negative 2nd scale degree. But most people don't use that term, although I have heard some people use it because they're trying to use something. And therefore, I think the better term would be a -1 and then use the term for going forward, which would be a major 7. So in other words, 12 minus 1 is going to be 11. We know that an 11 note away is a major 7, so a major 7 could be going 11 forward or -1 backwards. But what if we go past a scale degree? We go -12. Well, then we can go -12 again, and then I could call it like a -13 major 7. Similar kind of concept. My idea here being that we want to label the distance and then give the flavor notation that way. Notice we've lost scale degrees altogether going backwards. Therefore, it doesn't matter if we go up another octave, we're still don't have scale degrees. And therefore, I think the best thing to do is to add the notes to kind of define it if you're trying to think about what is actually happening. In our system over here, we can clearly go backwards because we can still keep the idea of going in the negative direction because we're measuring distance. So this would simply be 1 modal step back from the Ionian. If I go 1 modal step back, that would be like going 11 forward. So 11 forward, Ionian 6 is a 1 back, Ionian 1st. And the first modal half step, if you take 7 minus 1, that gives you the 6. So notice if we think about it going around the block, then I can go clockwise 11 steps from the Ionian node, or 6 modal half steps, or I can go backwards 1 note from the Ionian node, which would be also a negative or backwards. I'm not going to put 2 negatives. The negative flows through a negative modal half step back. So this is a more consistent terminology, and it preserves the ability to go backwards and forwards. The reason you can't do that with scale degrees is because it's off by 1, and you'd have to learn a whole different series of numbers because the measurement is off if you used scale degrees going in the negative direction. That's why it gets all messy. But this wouldn't be as messy because it makes sense. You're just measuring the steps clockwise or counterclockwise. So that means that if I go past, then here, I go past 12 backwards, I still think the nice thing to do is to say, well, I'm still going to list out its -13 steps back from the Ionian and then give the modal half steps that are the local as you're going around a clock, meaning the first modal half step backwards. But we could keep on going up on the modal half steps backwards, right? So I could call this then an Ionian, a -13 Ionian 8th modal half step backwards. And then I'd have to say 8 minus 7 because there's seven items, and that would give us the -1. So why would you do that? Well, that might be a little bit easier to say because then I could just keep on counting in the negative direction in modal half steps, and I won't have to say then the note distance. But I think from a practical standpoint, particularly on the guitar, we often want to say the flavor even if we're reaching past octaves, given the fact that the guitar has 6 strings and we're going to often be doing weird octave things, and we're usually just still calling it the same interval. But I would want to know the intervals backwards and forwards, and therefore I would distinguish the intervals by distance and then keep the same flavor idea. But you can do it either way. So now we're going to do it this way. So this one would be, if I went backwards, instead of calling it a -12 from the Ionian node, the 0 modal half step, I could call it a -12 from the Ionian node 7 modal half step. Now again, it's -7 modal half steps. Let me do that again. -7, -12 from the Ionian node, and then it would be 7 or -7 modal half steps. I've missed the negative again. So something like that, right? And so that 7 means that I kept going up after I went like around the horn. This one would be a -13 Ionian, and then the 8th modal half step. And this one would be a -14 Ionian and -8.5. I'm not putting another negative. The negative I'm imagining flows through. And this would be a -15 Ionian 9, -9 modal half step backwards. And then of course you could drop the -15 and just call it a negative Ionian 9th modal half step, which would be the -10th scale degree, right? Or an Ionian -9 modal half step backwards, if you want to think about it that way. So that's the idea. So this is the alternative way we can measure it. I think this is the nicer way to measure it backwards, but you could measure it this way, and it's more mathematically consistent as well, because then both terms are just going to keep on going up, and then you can subtract out 12 from the first number and 7 from the second to get to the same flavor that would be in the same octave. All right, so now I'd like to keep going backwards here, but do a formula. So let's like we did it going forwards. So I went forwards here, and then I said, here's the alternative method. This one's going to be an octave up from this one here. I'm using 12 instead of 0, so it's not going around the clock face. We're going on an infinite note number line forward from the Ionian node, but then the second number, I'm keeping it as though we're on a clock face to give us the flavor, the 0th modal half step, which was the same as up here. This one is a 14 note away, which is going to be 12 plus 2 or 2 plus 12. So we went up as though we're on a note number line going up to infinity as we increase from the Ionian node. But the second number, instead of continuing to go up, we said was the first modal half step forward as though we're going around in a clock. So we then said this is the alternative. It's a 12 note away Ionian 7th. So this second number is now going around in a circle. There's only 6 modal half steps. There's 7 notes or scale degrees, but only 6 for the distance. So this brings us around to here again. So if we took 7 minus 7, it would bring us to 0. This one is a 14 note away Ionian 8th modal half step. So if I took both of them down, the 14 minus 12, that gets us to the 2, and the 8 minus 7 gets us to the 1, which would be a 2 note away Ionian first. So I want to copy this alternative up here, but it's going to be a little wonky. So if I look at this formula, let's check it out. What I did is I wanted to pull the 12i and then take that 0, and the 0 plus 7 will give me what I need. It's a kind of an ugly formula. Let's check it out. We took the left side of this. So I want to take the left side and the last and the 3 numbers. So that's the 1, 2, and the I in this case. And then I want to take the right side, but I want to remove just the I and get that 0. So that's what this formula is doing. It's taking that right side and then subtracting the I from it, And then this whole bit's giving me 0, 0, and then I'm adding 7 to it. So let's see if I can just copy that formula up here. It might just work if I just copy it straight. I'm going to paste formulas only. So something is missing, so let's see what it's doing. Okay, so what's the problem here? Notice that this has an extra character on the left with the negative sign. So now when it says left and I need to be picking up, this needs to be 4. I need to pick up 4 characters instead of 3 because there's always going to be a negative sign. So now it's a negative 12 Ionian 7th, and I think that works. So let's copy that up and see if it works going up 1. So negative 13. All right, I think this is working. So that means that we had a negative, so this is going to be, let's just count it as we go. It was a 0, 0, an Ionian. It was a 0 Ionian, 0 modal half step. If I go 12, now it's a negative 12 Ionian, 0 modal half step. Or I could say it's a negative 12 from the Ionian node, negative 7th modal half step backwards, right? And then 7 minus 7 would get me back to 0. This one is so this one is a negative 13 Ionian first modal half step backwards. That would be equivalent to this one right here, right? Because 13 minus 12 would give me negative 1 Ionian first modal half step backwards, or I can call it a negative 13 from the Ionian node, negative 8 modal half step. Again, that negative I'm imagining just follows through. This one then would be a negative 14 from the Ionian node, negative 1.5 modal half steps, or negative 14 from the Ionian node, negative 8.5 modal half steps backwards. This would be negative 15 from the Ionian node, negative 2nd modal half step backwards, which you would think would be the negative 3rd scale degree if there were scale degrees, but we don't really have those, right? But we would say negative 15 from the Ionian node, negative 9th modal half step backwards. So we can then copy this up here. It's going to change once I go. Let's make this a little larger. Something, is that right? I think that's still right. Negative 23 and negative, I think that's right. So let's copy this here and paste the formula. So negative 24 I7. I think that's what I have in my notes. So now, negative 24 I negative 7, I have to add 2 7s because it's going to be 2 octaves up. So now you've got a negative 24 Ionian 14. So in this one, I kept it the same. Now it's negative 24, so you can see that you'd have to subtract 12 and then 12 to bring you back to 0 and 0. Zeros if it was going around a clock face and we weren't going up in a number line. And then the Ionian, this one is said as though we're going around a clock. But if you put both of them going upwards as though you're going up a note number line, it would be a 24 from the Ionian 14, right? And then you'd have to subtract 12 and 12 here and 7 and 7 on this side to get you back to the local distance if it was within 1 octave, which would be 0 Ionian 0th modal half step forward. So I can copy this all the way back, and I think it works. So hopefully that works. I think it does. So let's copy this whole thing now, and I can just copy this whole thing and paste it into the Dorian, boom, that we already set up. So does that make sense? The 0 from the Dorian node, 0 modal half steps, would be negative 12 from the Dorian mode, 0 modal half steps, or negative 12 from the Dorian mode, negative 7 modal half steps backwards. And then let's keep it going. Let's do from the Phrygian. So if I was on the Phrygian and I looked at like this one, it would be a negative 2p1. If I add 12 to it, steps backwards, negative 14 from the Phrygian node, negative 1 modal half step backwards, which would be the negative 2 scale degree, versus negative 14 modal half steps backwards from the Phrygian node, negative 8 negative 14 notes backwards from the Phrygian, which would be -8 modal half steps, which would be the -9th scale degree if we had negative scale degrees. See, and then this one going forward would be, so that's going to be this one. You could see, then you could figure it out going forwards, right? So it would be 12 minus 2, which would be 10, a 10 note away perfect 6. So 10 note away perfect 6 modal half step, which would be a perfect 7th scale degree. So that's going to be the idea. Let's see. Let's copy this, copy that, Roger that. Let's copy it through. I think it's working. And so we'll put it over here. This is going to be very popular, I can see, because this table is beautiful. Look at this. No one's going to be confused by that at all. That's like perfectly done. I can't believe I don't get more attraction on this whole concept. So this is going to be a -12y from the Lydian mode, 7th modal half step backwards, as opposed to -12 from the y 0th modal half steps backwards. So I'm going to go to the Mixolydian, double click on this one. Similarly, instead of having the 0 Mixolydian 0, we have the -12 Mixolydian and then the 0, or -12 Mixolydian -7 modal half steps backwards. Let's copy it here from the Aeolian. Aeolian is going to be, instead of saying it's a -0 A0, it's going to be -12 Aeolian 0th modal half step backwards, or -12 Aeolian -7 modal half steps backwards, and then you would have to subtract 12 for the octave and 7 for the octave to get it back to where it would be if you think about it as a clock face. And then one more time for the Locrian, the crazy Locrian. These are crazier than the protesters out there these days. Okay, so we're going to say these are going to be the 0 N0. It's going to be -12 notes from the Locrian node, -0 modal half steps backward, or -12 notes from the Locrian node, -7 modal half steps backwards. All right, I think we've basically completed the table here. It's a beautiful thing. So there's that. We could probably fill in a few more gaps here, but I think that's basically our table. So just go ahead and memorize that, and then we'll get back to going from there.